안녕하세요. 국제소위원회 위원장 홍익대학교 김동균입니다. 저희 학회가 더욱 세계적인 학술단체로 거듭나기 위한 염원을 담아 올해에는 특별한 기조강연자를 모셨습니다. University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign의 무르제스 시바팔란 교수님입니다. 시바팔란 교수님께서는 지난 50년 동안 600여 편의 논문을 집필하셨으며 논문 피인용 수는 3만 1000회, H인덱스는 91로 세계를 대표하는 수문학자로서 저널 오브 하이드롤로지, 워터 리소시스 리서치, 그리고 하이드롤로지 앤 얼 시스템 사이언스의 부편집장 및 편집장을 역임하셨습니다. 또한 우리 시대를 대표하는 수문학자에게 수여되는 알프레드 베게너 메달과 로버트 호트 메달을 수상하셨습니다. 최근에는 수문 시스템과 인간 사회의 상호작용을 연구하는 사회수문학 분야를 새롭게 개척하셔서 저희 분야의 연구를 이끌고 계십니다. 인터넷 세선이 불안할 것을 대비해서 미리 녹화한 영상을 준비하였습니다. 네.
Good afternoon. I'm coming from Champaign, Illinois. I'm really delighted to be attending this conference and truly grateful to the Korea Water Resources Association for giving me an opportunity to present this talk. I have to admit that at the outset that I'm only a hydrologist with very little experience in water management anywhere in the world, let alone Korea. So I hope you will bear with me. In my talk, I will take you on a tour around the world and present examples of the water security crisis and share lessons that I have learned by looking at water management through the prism of social hydrology. 3 years ago, I attended a conference in my hometown of Jaffna, Sri Lanka, and talked at public forums about the water crisis. These are some newspaper articles that appeared following my visit. My talk today reflects some of the messages in these newspaper articles. More about Sri Lanka later. I start with the definition of water security as the reliable availability of an acceptable quantity and quality of water for health, livelihoods, and production, coupled with an acceptable level of water-related risks. One of the first lessons that I have learned is that water security is not just about water. Sometimes it's not even about water. I will anchor my talk on water supply management that aims to meet the water supply needs of a community. Typically, from an engineering perspective, this boils down to matching demand with supply, except that it gets more complicated in that the infrastructure needed to meet the demand needs investment, which is itself a major challenge in many communities. Even when this is possible, one often finds that there is failure because insufficient attention is given to governance. The result is the water crisis. Even in developed societies such as the United States, in cities like Flint, Michigan, or affluent cities like Chicago, located right next to the Great Lakes, who cannot find a way to meet the needs of all their citizens. Forget about large cities in India, Africa, or South America. It indicates that the water crisis is really a governance crisis. It is more than about science, engineering, or economics. It is in fact social, which makes it a wicked problem and needs more than rocket science to solve. Governance forces us to make decisions involving choices and trade-offs. For example, our own livelihoods versus the environment, rich versus poor, upstream versus downstream, city versus rural, agricultural versus industrial. What is the appropriate balance between meeting short-term needs and their long-term consequences? So these are all value judgments which together form our culture. What kind of people do we aspire to be, for example? In traditional water management, the values that underpin our decisions are assumed to be fixed over the design life of the systems that we build for water management. In the short term, this may be okay. But in the long term, culture and the values and preferences that underpin it are not fixed and in fact evolve due to our own lived experiences. Failure to account for these changes give rise to what we call unintended consequences, which environmentalist William Odom has called the tyranny of small decisions. I will now illustrate this with a few examples taken from socio-hydrology. I first look at the Murrumbidgee River Basin, which is a sub-basin of the Murray-Darling River Basin in eastern Australia. Murrumbidgee underwent 100 years of irrigation development, which involved building a series of dams and reservoirs, which allowed the farmers to put more land to agriculture and increase agriculture productivity, improve farmer livelihood, which meant a positive spiraling that happened at the expense of the environment. Increased extraction of water meant that by the year 2000, not a drop of water was flowing to the ocean, and rivers and wetlands all dried up. This triggered a reaction in the community, fueled a green movement, which eventually forced the government to enact measures, including laws to return water back to the environment, with the inefficient farmers being forced to give up farming and migrate to the cities or move to other industries, with the attendant loss of population. We called it the pendulum swing. We built a simple socio-hydrological model to describe this phenomenon, expressed in terms of a set of coupled differential equations that captured the hydrology, agriculture, population dynamics, ecology, and also the social system expressed in terms of what we call the environmental awareness. And we obtained very good results in terms of mimicking the dynamics that happened. More importantly, the lesson that we learned is that the pendulum swing was a result of two forces acting against each other, a yin and the yang, a productive force and a restorative force. Human beings having to make the choice between their economic livelihood and ecosystem health. As more and more water was being extracted, it led to reduced stream flow downstream, which led to environmental degradation, which led to environmental awareness and activism, which then led to the turnaround through government action to return water back to the environment, and hence the pendulum swing. Interestingly, this is reflected also in community attitudes about economic well-being and environmental awareness that were quantified through independent analysis of newspaper articles over 100 years in Australia. You can see economic well-being going down and environmental awareness going up in importance to the community. I want to now give a few more examples of similar historical changes. Something very similar to Murrumbidgee also happened in Western Australia, also a pendulum swing, but slightly different circumstances. Here the story is forest clearing for agricultural crops. As more and more land was cleared of forest, agricultural productivity rose, population increased, GDP increased, and so on. However, over time, the replacement of forest by crops led to a change in the water balance, which led to rising water tables, which had the negative effect of rising salinities, which was not foreseen, and which eventually led to loss of agricultural productivity and population decrease and so on, and hence the pendulum swing that happened in Western Australia. So to address these issues, we came up with an extended form of the conceptual model, essentially to address the yin and the yang, in the form of two loops: an economic loop that contributes to the positive spiral upwards, and a sensitivity loop or an environmental sensitivity loop that led to the turnaround. And here we replaced the environmental awareness with something called the community sensitivity state variable that reflected community attitudes about economics and the environment, which was rooted in culture. We applied this model to other situations or contexts, which I will now describe through a few more examples. I take you now to Kissimmee River in Florida. Over the last several decades, the Kissimmee River has undergone something like a pendulum swing. The basin suffered frequent flooding due to the tropical cyclones that hit the area. The people of South Florida convinced Congress and the federal government in the late 1940s, at the expense of billions of dollars, to straighten the river as a way to reduce flooding damage, as you can see in this picture here. However, in the intervening decades, with the growth of the Orlando area, new and more affluent people moved in to the upstream areas of the basin. They came with different value systems. They wanted the natural environment to return. So in effect, you have a competition between the value systems of two different groups of people, upstream and downstream. One group of people wanted a more pristine environment. Another group of people wanted continued protection from floods. And in the end, the upstream people won because they had more political power. And so the river was re-meandered back to its original state at the expense of more billions of dollars. We were able to model this turnaround using the community sensitivity as a state variable, but treating the problem as a transboundary problem between the upstream people and the downstream people having different value systems. I now pick another example from Xinjiang province in Western China, a similar problem of people making choices between economic well-being and ecosystem health in this otherwise hyper-arid and highly sensitive environment. Extraction of water for agriculture led to the drying of rivers and lakes and loss of previous very precious so-called poplar trees. The government imposed water-saving technology in the form of plastic mulching as a way of improving the efficiency of irrigated agriculture. This was dramatically successful, except that the improvement of irrigation efficiency did not lead to improvement of ecosystem health, because farmers used the water that they saved back into increased productivity by expanding the irrigated area they put under crops. So this is what you see in this slide. An exponential growth of irrigation efficiency coincides with an exponential growth of water consumption. Another unintended consequence. Other examples of unintended consequences that we have brought out in social hydrology. For example, the building of reservoirs to tide over the effects of droughts we found only led to demand going up. So while overcoming water shortages in the short term, they exacerbate water shortages in the long term. Other examples of trade-offs I want to mention: the flooding and evacuation of the entire city of Brisbane, Australia. The region was experiencing a major drought, the so-called millennium drought, and the operators of the flood control dams upstream of the city, because of the drought, they were more concerned about keeping water in the dam high enough to cater to the water supply needs of farmers, only to face a sudden tropical cyclone that dumped record amounts of rainfall in a short period of time. And to avoid the dam overflowing and overtopping, the operators had to release water quickly with little notice, which is what caused the city to flood. So this involved a trade-off between flood risk and drought risk that the operators had to manage and did not plan for. So all these are examples of co-evolution, of change in hydrology and society, something that the Greek philosopher Heraclitus had described as no man ever steps in the same river twice, because it is not the same river and he is not the same man. And the science of social hydrology was launched to deal with this co-evolution resulting from the two-way feedbacks between humans and water. One of the goals of social hydrology has been to develop understanding of phenomena or unintended consequences that arose in the usual practice of water management. One of the challenges of building more resilience in water management in the context of change is to fully account for what we call human agency. The fact that humans adapt to new information, including predictions about their own behavior, as this cartoon illustrates. In particular, culture and human values and preferences that underpin it, in the context of social hydrology, must be made endogenous to water management decisions and not imposed externally and then assumed to be fixed. This kind of assumption is even more important than making assumptions about rationality and utility maximization that underpins much of water management these days. Okay, so in the context of social hydrology now, the goal of predictions now is not just to design the most optimal solution as we usually do, but rather generate the so-called possibility space of possible future trajectories of human development under alternative choices and trade-offs that human societies make, with values and preferences that are allowed to co-evolve together. Okay, let me now return to Sri Lanka and the water crisis in my hometown in the Jaffna Peninsula, which is undergoing a severe water crisis right now. Jaffna Peninsula is named after the city of Jaffna, the cultural capital of Sri Lankan Tamils. My hometown is near the tip of Sri Lanka. This is my hometown here, this red star. And my high school is in Point Pedro here, just for your interest. So compared to the rest of the country, Sri Lanka, the northern province, and especially the Jaffna Peninsula, have had major water security issues over the years. In fact, the people of Jaffna were defined by the water security challenges they faced over hundreds of years. Problems that were exacerbated since the civil war that ended in 2009. So you can see Jaffna Peninsula and the northern province, the rest of the province. So some hydrological background. Water resources in Jaffna are highly variable. The peninsula itself has no rivers or freshwater lakes. It rains only a few months of the year during the monsoon season, as you can see here. The main source of water is therefore groundwater, and whose recharge is subject to the whims of the monsoons. The aquifer itself is karstic, highly variable, and essentially a hit and miss proposition in terms of where you can find water. The main aquifers, reliable aquifers, are located in a few pockets, as you can see in this picture here. The three main aquifers in the Jaffna Peninsula. The thickness of the groundwater lenses is no more than 10 to 20 meters, as you can see in this picture. And you have to also consider the compounding effects of the oceans and the lagoons that surround the peninsula. So saltwater intrusion is a major environmental problem. So now let me talk about the consequences for water supply solutions. Because of the nature of the resource, highly variable, no rivers and or lakes, highly variable groundwater aquifers, and the possibility of saltwater intrusion. So only decentralized solutions are possible. No, there's no possibility of centralized solution. No reservoirs are possible. There's no one large aquifer. So the result is essentially rain-fed agriculture. A combination of rain-fed agriculture for rice production and irrigated agriculture using groundwater for vegetables and other kinds of cash crops. And historically, over hundreds of years, the human settlements reflected this distribution of water supply sources. So here's an example of rain-fed agriculture and irrigated agriculture using groundwater. Now let me take you back to the mainland, as we call it. So in the mainland, south of the peninsula, we have a few rivers which are mostly ephemeral and very little groundwater. And this area was not very populated until the 1970s. So with the presence of rivers, centralization was not only possible, but was essential to encourage people to migrate and settle in this area. So that is what happened. So they built reservoirs. This is an example of a reservoir that was built, and as a result, people migrated from the peninsula into the mainland. And in this case, they entered into both rice production and vegetables and cash crops, but they depended on stored surface water in this reservoir, which was a key resource for water for agriculture. So you can see the availability of water resources was an important part of the distribution of settlements, including new settlements in the mainland. And then we had this 30-year civil war that finished in 2009. After the end of the war, the water crisis especially in the Jaffna Peninsula only intensified. And giving rise to excessive pumping of groundwater, they installed, instead of traditional dug well, they introduced tube wells. There was almost free electricity available. So excessive pumping of groundwater, excessive application of fertilizers and pesticides. And there was also increased tourism and leading to new hotels and other industries, which led to even more pumping of groundwater. And the entire peninsula had no sewage disposal. So adding to the already existing sewage disposal problem in the peninsula. So this all happened in the last 15 years. So the intensification of agriculture contributed to serious consequences. For example, contamination, groundwater contamination, due to nitrates and other fertilizer residues, E. coli due to lack of sewage treatment, salinity due to saltwater intrusion, and all of this is giving rise to severe impacts on human health. And people are experiencing the drying of wells because of excessive pumping, and also, as I said, saltwater intrusion. So these are some severe consequences that result from intensification of agriculture and other industries in the peninsula. So in terms of solutions, there are two kinds of solutions are being offered. One is called soft path solutions. This is what I advocated when I was visiting there. So examples of soft path solutions is, for example, to make agriculture more water efficient, change to drip irrigation from flood irrigation, change to less water consuming crops, start charging for groundwater so that consumption can be reduced, restructure the economy. For example, move the agriculture from Jaffna Peninsula to the mainland. Bring other kinds of industries, non-agricultural, for example, knowledge-based industry to Jaffna, and return back to decentralized water management. As opposed to that, engineers and politicians and funding agencies like the Asian Development Bank, they favored more hard path solutions. For example, one option was to increase the storage in the main reservoir in the mainland, and then divert water from the mainland to Jaffna Peninsula to supply the drinking water needs and sanitation needs of major cities in the Jaffna Peninsula, which means that you're taking water away from the mainland and basically jeopardizing the agricultural productivity in the mainland. And it is already contributing to transboundary conflict between these two regions. The other option is desalination of seawater. Asian Development Bank was supporting it, and in fact, it turns out that was a solution that has been recently adopted, with no concerns about who will pay for its maintenance in the long term, no consideration for the groundwater contamination issue that I explained to you before, and no consideration of the kind of unintended consequences you are bound to expect in the long term. So it's all a short-term, quick fix solution that the engineers and the politicians and the funding agencies were advocating. So those are the two choices in front of the people of Jaffna Peninsula. Those are the two choices that are in front of people everywhere that are dealing with water management issues. Hard path solutions versus soft path solutions. The reality, the experience that I have presented to you so far, as I already mentioned to you, is that the water security is not just about water. So if you look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, there is a Sustainable Development Goal for fresh water, but water also underpins several other Sustainable Development Goals. So water is involved in many things that people are interested in. And so when you focus only on water, only on fresh water, and ignore the other issues that water touches, you are bound to contribute to the development of unintended consequences. And these are some of the unintended consequences that we in social hydrology are studying. They happen because you take a very narrow perspective, look at water management in a narrow, mostly engineering perspective of meeting supply and demand. So let me conclude my talk with this with this quote from a political blog that appeared in 2012 at the end of the 2012 presidential election. It says, organizations with narrow fields of vision become institutionally incapable of spotting where the icebergs ahead are located. That is the message that I want to communicate to you based on my experience of studying water management crises around the world through the prism of social hydrology. I hope that made some sense to you as you yourself are dealing with water management decisions in Korea. I'm sure you are dealing with similar kind of issues, and I believe that the lessons that we have learned in social hydrology can be extremely helpful in charting your own course of water management over the next century. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening.